This video will discuss China's international and domestic policy and its economic repercussions on the country itself. The first video will discuss China's policy in the South China Sea, specifically its recent aggressiveness in that region. We will talk about an overview of what the South China Sea dispute is, discuss the importance of the South China Sea as a trade route, talk about the economic interdependence of the disputant states involved in the South China Sea, look at the drivers behind China's economic growth, and finally, assess the potential impact of the dispute on the Chinese economy. The second portion of the video will talk about Chinese domestic policy by looking at their ranking in the economic freedom, and then also talk about President Xi's recent economic reforms to the Chinese economy and whether he has kept his promises, especially when we look at his recent intervention in the Chinese stock market. The South China Sea dispute involves multiple states. They are Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, Taiwan, and China. And the area of the dispute is the South China Sea, which is bounded by the Gulf of Thailand and the Taiwan Strait. The South China Sea has always been a fertile fishing ground, and fishermen from all the disputant states often visit the area for their fishing. In addition, in the 1970s, it has been rumored that there exists vast amounts of oil and natural gas reserves in the South China Sea. Ever since then, tension has been rising within the South China Sea, and the states have been competing to stake their claim over these islands and features in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is an extremely important trade route because it is passage to more than a third of global crude oil trade and half of global liquefied natural gas trade. In addition, half of the world's merchant fleet tonnage passes through the region. Disruptions to the flow of free trade in the region could potentially have disastrous economic consequences. To assess whether a disruption in the trade in the South China Sea will have an effect on China's economy, we will have to look at the degree of economic interdependence between China and respective states. Among the disputant states, 4 of the 6 states are part of ASEAN. And ASEAN is a political and economic organization of Southeast Asian countries that was founded in 1967. And as we can see, China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, accounting for 14% of total trade. And likewise, ASEAN is pretty important to China as well, as it is China's third largest trading partner. Therefore, with regards to trade, it seems that the Chinese economy is relatively intertwined with the other states that are involved in dispute, and not to mention with the global economy. The meteoric rise of the Chinese economy since 1978 up to today can be attributed to an export-driven and low-cost producer economy. However, that is about to change with modern China. They are looking to transition to a market-oriented economy and one that is more dependent on domestic consumption as compared to exports and low-cost production. Nonetheless, China still remains relatively reliant on exports and investments. Exports still account for more than a fifth of Chinese GDP, and investments account for 48% of GDP. Nonetheless, China is seeing an increase in domestic consumption. Recent growth figures show that 51.2% of economic growth was driven by consumption. Therefore, let us analyze the situation should China impose a trade restriction on the South China Sea through the use of military force. Such a scenario is a lose-lose situation for China and the disputant states. Although we have shown that China is trying to transit from an economy that's reliant on exports and trade to one that's reliant on domestic consumption, it still plays an important role. Trade, that is, still plays an extremely important role in Chinese economy. Therefore, By restricting trade in the region, China will be effectively building its own demise, as well as hurting the global economy. Hence, it is unlikely that the South China Sea dispute will lead to an escalation of the conflict to the point that it affects regional and global trade. In fact, despite increased tensions in the South China Sea, Chinese trade with the disputant states have increased rather than decreased. The next portion of this video will discuss Chinese domestic policy and how it affects economic freedom. As we can see from the table, the Chinese economy does not fare very well in the Economic Freedom Index, ranking at 139. This can be attributed to the fact that China was essentially a planned economy under Mao Zedong up till 1978, where President Deng Xiaoping instituted reforms to deregulate. Following the footsteps of his predecessor, the current president, President Xi Jinping, proclaims that he would like to institute a series of economic reforms that will use the market forces to play a decisive role in resource allocation, and as a consequence, the government will seek to shrink its role in the allocation of resources. President Xi has instituted some policies that would seem to have increased economic freedom for China. Specifically, he made it easier to set up businesses. He also published a plan to deregulate the pharmaceutical industry, and also he facilitated investments between the mainland and Hong Kong by setting up a direct link between the two stock markets. Perhaps most controversially, he has embarked on an anti-corruption campaign by persecuting more than 70,000 officials for corruption charges. While this may seem to some critics that President Xi Jinping's recent activities in the stock market in China seem to have led China to regress further in economic freedom instead of improving it, as what he proclaimed when he first became president and stated in his economic reforms. The state's measures to stabilize the market have raised eyebrows among critics of the Chinese economy. These measures include halting initial public offerings, recruiting brokerages to buy back at least $200 billion worth of shares, and restricting short selling. Therefore, it would seem that despite President Xi's promises for economic reform, he will not be acting on them, and China is potentially regressing on economic freedom. Nonetheless, we have to look at this issue in context. It should be noted that in the past, Chinese growth has largely been driven by state lending. And with the maturing of the Chinese economy, it has to transit to a different type of economy, one that has a greater dependency on current financial markets. And hence, the state's recent intervention in the stock market could potentially be seen as a short-term method of stabilizing the stock market so that it presents it as a viable option in the future for investors and firms. If we look at intervention from this point of view, it would seem that Xi is actually trying to breed a free stock market that is stable for the future and the investors in China. While this may undermine economic freedom in the short term, it should, in the long run, make the Chinese stock market a more viable option for investors and firms, and therefore lead to more economic freedom in China. In conclusion, with respect to the international arena, Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea could indicate a scenario where they would use military force. However, given the importance of global trade, it is unlikely that China will resort to such a measure because it does nobody any good economically and politically. Domestically, the success of some of President Xi Jinping's economic reforms by introducing competition should not be undermined by the pessimistic views of Xi's anti-corruption drive. Although his recent actions in the stock market may seem to run contradictory to his reforms, but when juxtaposed against the dynamics of the Chinese stock market and the transitioning of the Chinese economy, such actions may increase greater economic freedom in the long run.